Beneath the polished floors of one of Australia's busiest railway stations, thousands of commuters walk every single day without knowing what lies beneath their feet. Buried under layers of concrete, rubble, and more than a century of forgotten history, there is a machine. Not just any machine. A prototype steam engine, one that was supposed to change everything about how Victoria moved people and freight across its young, sprawling colony. And for reasons that have more to do with politics than engineering, it was sealed away, abandoned in the dark, and erased from the official record. Melbourne's Flinders Street Station is an icon. Its yellow facade and green copper dome have graced postcards, film sets, and the memories of millions. But long before Flinders Street became the city's railway heart, there was another station, one that sat at the true crossroads of colonial ambition. Spencer Street Station, now known as Southern Cross, served as Melbourne's primary terminus for decades, and it was beneath this station, during one of the most chaotic periods of Victorian railway development, that a prototype locomotive was quietly entombed. The story begins in the 1850s, at the absolute peak of the gold rush. Victoria's population had exploded. In just a few years, Melbourne transformed from a modest pastoral settlement into one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Gold was pouring out of Ballarat and Bendigo, and the single greatest bottleneck was transport. Roads were unreliable. Bullock carts moved at walking pace. The rivers were too shallow for serious commerce. Everyone agreed on one thing. Victoria needed railways, and it needed them fast. The colonial government moved with extraordinary speed. The Melbourne and Hobson's Bay Railway had already opened in 1854, connecting the city to its port, but that was a short, flat line, essentially a demonstration project. The real challenge was pushing iron rails northwest through undulating terrain toward the goldfields. Multiple private companies formed, each promising to solve the problem. Engineers arrived from Britain, Ireland, and even the United States, lured by contracts and the promise of colonial fortunes. And with them came locomotives, imported at enormous expense, shipped in pieces across the ocean, and reassembled in primitive workshops on the banks of the Yarra. But not every locomotive that arrived in Melbourne came from established British builders. At least one was different. Records from the Victorian Railway's archives, fragmentary and water-damaged though they are, reference a trial engine delivered to Spencer Street in 1857. The documents describe it not as an imported machine, but as a locally assembled prototype, built using a mix of British-supplied components and locally cast parts. Its boiler was reportedly fabricated in a foundry on the south bank of the Yarra, one of several small metalworks that had sprung up to serve the mining industry. The frame and wheels were shipped from England, but the cab, tender, and much of the pipework were colonial made. This was extraordinary. In 1857, the idea that a colony barely 2 decades old could produce anything resembling a working locomotive was almost laughable to the engineering establishment back in London. Other British manufacturers like Robert Stephenson and Company, Sharp Brothers, and Bayer Peacock dominated the global locomotive market. They supplied engines to India, South America, Africa, and the Australian colonies with mechanical precision and ruthless efficiency. A colonial prototype was not just unusual, it was a direct challenge to their commercial monopoly. The engine, referenced in surviving correspondence only as the Spencer Street trial engine appears to have been a small 040 saddle tank design. That configuration, 4 coupled driving wheels, no leading or trailing truck, with a water tank draped over the boiler, was common for shunting and short-haul work. Its estimated weight was around 15 tons, modest even by the standards of the day. Boiler pressure was listed at 90 pounds per square inch, which placed it firmly in the lower range but still within operational norms for light duties. What made the engine significant was not its specifications, it was the principle behind it. A group of colonial engineers, backed by a small consortium of Melbourne businessmen, wanted to prove that Victoria did not need to depend entirely on British imports. If local industry could build even basic locomotives, the cost savings would be enormous. Shipping a locomotive from Manchester to Melbourne took 3 to 4 months and added hundreds of pounds to the price. Local production, even partial local production, could cut delivery times to weeks and reduce costs by as much as 40%. The trial engine was reportedly tested on a short section of track near Spencer Street in late 1857 or early 1858. Accounts differ on whether it actually hauled any load. One letter, written by a junior engineer named William Rankin to his brother in Glasgow, describes watching the colonial engine make several short runs under its own steam, pulling a single empty wagon. Rankin called it rough but willing, noting that the boiler held pressure adequately, but the valve gear was poorly timed, causing the engine to lurch and stall at low speed. He concluded, with the blunt pragmatism of a trained Glaswegian engineer, that it would serve for yard work, but wants considerable refinement before any mainline duty. That refinement never came. Within months of the trial, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The Victorian government, under pressure from British trade interests and its own financial overcommitments, moved to nationalise the colony's railways. Private companies were bought out, merged, or dissolved. The small consortium behind the prototype lost its backing. More critically, the government signed new bulk contracts with established British locomotive builders, guaranteeing a steady supply of proven machines at negotiated prices. The prototype was no longer just unnecessary. It was politically inconvenient. Its very existence implied that the expensive British contracts might not have been the only option. What happened next is where the story slips from documented history into local legend. According to accounts that surfaced in the early 20th century, the trial engine was not scrapped in the usual sense. It was too small and too incomplete to be worth dismantling for parts. Instead, as during one of the many phases of construction and expansion at Spencer Street Station, the engine was simply buried. Pushed into a siding that was being filled in and paved over, it disappeared beneath the growing station infrastructure. By the 1870s, when Spencer Street had been substantially rebuilt and expanded, there was no visible trace of it. This might sound implausible, but it is far from unique. Railway archaeology has revealed buried locomotives and rolling stock at sites across the world. In England, a locomotive was famously discovered buried near the entrance to the Crystal Palace in the 1970s. In New York, fragments of early subway cars have been found sealed in abandoned tunnel sections. Construction practices of the 19th century were often brutal in their simplicity. If something was in the way and too heavy to move easily, It was cheaper to build over it than to remove it. Melbourne's own history supports the possibility. The city was built fast, rebuilt often, and documented inconsistently. Entire streets were raised by several feet during the 1890s to improve drainage. Buildings were demolished and rebuilt on compressed timelines. The underground spaces beneath major stations became warrens of forgotten infrastructure. Abandoned platforms, sealed tunnels, bricked-up passages. Southern Cross Station, which replaced the old Spencer Street complex in a massive redevelopment completed in 2006, sits on layers of accumulated construction spanning more than 150 years. During that 2006 redevelopment, workers reportedly encountered unexpected metallic structures during deep excavation near the station's western end. Engineering reports from the project reference remnants of early rail infrastructure without elaboration. No public announcement was made about any locomotive discovery, but sources within the construction teams have spoken, off the record, about finding something that looked like a boiler embedded in compacted fill material several meters below the modern track level. Whether this was the 1857 prototype, a discarded piece of later equipment, or simply a misidentified industrial remnant, remains unknown. The Victorian Railway's historical archives, now held by the Public Record Office Victoria, contain no definitive record of the prototype's fate. The relevant files from the late 1850s are incomplete, damaged by floods, fires, and the general institutional neglect that plagued colonial record-keeping. What survives are fragments, a requisition order for castings, local supply, for engine trial. A brief mention in a parliamentary committee report about experimental works at Spencer Street, and Rankin's letter, which was donated to the State Library of Victoria in 1923 by his descendants and remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the engine in operation. What makes this story resonate is not the machine itself, a small, crude, underpowered prototype that may or may not have worked properly is not, on its own, a landmark of engineering history. What matters is what it represents. The moment a young colony tried to stand on its own industrial feet, and was pushed back down by the economics of empire. British manufacturers did not just sell locomotives to Australia. They sold dependency. Every engine, every rail, every bolt and fish plate that arrived by ship reinforced a commercial relationship that kept colonial industry subordinate to metropolitan suppliers. The Spencer Street prototype, however imperfect, was a crack in that system, and cracks in an empire built on trade were not tolerated. Today, if you stand on the platforms at Southern Cross Station and look down, you are standing on more than concrete and steel. You are standing on layers of decisions, political, economic, and industrial, that shaped a nation's relationship with its own capacity to build. Somewhere beneath your feet, possibly still intact, possibly long since crushed and corroded, there may be the remains of a machine that was never given a fair chance. A prototype that ran once, maybe twice, and was buried not because it failed, but because it succeeded just enough to be dangerous. And that, in the end, is the story that Melbourne's busiest station has been keeping secret for more than 160 years.